Chapter 3. The days went by. At first, Kristin felt no fear. She didn't care to ponder what Erland might mean by these doings, running off from home in sudden wrath at dead of night, or how long he was minded to sit up north there on his hill farm and punish her with his absence. She was bitterly wroth with her husband, angered all the more because she didn't deny that she too had been in the wrong and had spoken words that she wished now could be unsaid. Sure enough, she had been in the wrong many a time, and had often in wrath said hateful and unseemly things to her husband. But what hurt her most bitterly was that Erland could never offer to forget and to forgive, except that she first humbled herself and begged it of him meekly. It was not so often either, thought she, that she had done amiss. Didn't he understand it was oftenest when she was wearied and worn with cares and fears that she had striven to bear in silence? 'Twas then she most readily lost the mastery of herself. She thought that Erland might have remembered that, beside all the disquietude for their son's future that she had borne these many, many days, twice this summer she had gone through a time of deadly fear for Nakvi. Her eyes had been opened now to see that, after the young mother's pains and travail are over, there comes for the ageing mother fears and woe of a different kind. His careless talk of having no fear for the fortunes of their sons had goaded her till she was like a wild mother bear, or like a bitch with whelps. She didn't care if Erland likened her to a bitch in all that touched her children. For them she would be watchful and unsleeping as a mother bitch, so long as there was life in her. And if, for such a cause, he could forget that she had stood by him in every time of need, with all her powers, that in despite of her anger she had been both just and forgiving when he struck her, and when he was false to her with the hateful wanton Lensvik woman, then he must even forget. Even now, when she thought on it, she could not feel so much wrath and bitterness against Erland for this, the worst of his offences against her. When she turned on him with reproaches for that, it was because she knew that he repented it himself, that in this he saw and felt he had done evil. But never had she been so wroth with Erland, neither was she now, that the memory of his blow and of his faithlessness, with all it brought with it, did not trouble her most of all for the man's own sake. She felt always that in these outbursts of his ungoverned spirit he had sinned against himself and his soul's welfare far more than against her. What went on rankling in her spirit were all the little wounds he had dealt her with his unkind heedlessness, his childish lack of patience, even with his wild and thoughtless way of loving, when at times he showed that, in spite of all, he did love her. It was all the years when she was young and soft of soul, and had felt that both health and courage must fall short, encumbered as she was with all those helpless children, if the father, the husband, would not show he had strength and loving kindness wherewith to guard her and the little ones upon her knees. It had been such a torment to feel herself weak of body, simple and unlessoned in mind, and not dare trust securely in her husband's strength and wisdom. It was as though she had got heart wounds then that would never heal again. Even the sweet delight that it was to lift up her suckling, set its lovesome mouth to her breast, and feel the little warm soft body upon her arm, had been made bitter by fear and fret. So small, so defenceless you are, and all too often your father forgets that his first thought should be to make you secure. And now, when her little children's bones were set, and their heads had hardened, but they yet lacked somewhat of a grown man's wit, now he lured them away from her. They melted away from her, the whole flock, husband and sons, in that strange boyish light-mindedness that she thought she had seen glimpses of in all the men she had met, and where a sad, careful woman can never follow. So for her own part it was but sorrow and anger she felt when she thought on Erland. But she grew fearful when she wondered what her sons were thinking. Ulf had been up to Dover with 2 pack-horses to bear to Erland the things he had asked should be sent after him: clothes, weapons in plenty, all his 4 bows, sacks full of arrowheads and crossbow bolts, and 3 of the dogs. Munin and Lavrans had wept bitterly when Ulf took the little smooth-haired bitch with silky, soft-hanging ear-laps. She was a fine outlandish beast that Erland had been given by the abbot at home. That their father owned such a rare dog seemed, more than anything else, to raise him above all other men in the eyes of the 2 little ones. And then their father had promised them that, when the bitch had pups again, they should each choose one from the litter. When Ulf Haldarsson came back, Kristin asked if Erland had said when he thought he would return home again. "No," said Ulf. "It looks as though he has a mind to stay on there for a long while." Of his own accord, Ulf said but little more of his journey to Haugen, and Kristin was loath to ask. In autumn, when they flitted in from the new storehouse, the eldest son said they would like this winter to sleep above stairs in the upper hall-room. Kristin gave them leave, and thus she was left to sleep with the 2 youngest in the great hall below. The first evening she said that Lavrans too might lie in the bed with her now. The boy lay blissfully rolling about and boring himself down into the bedding. The children were used to have their couch made up on the bench on leathern sacks filled with straw, and to have fur skins to wrap them in. But in the bed there were blue bolster mattresses to lie upon, and fine coverlids as well as the furs, and the parents had fine white linen covers on their pillows. "Will it be but till father comes home that I may lie here?" asked Lavrans. "Then, perhaps, we must go back to the bench again, mother?" "Then you may sleep in Narkvi and Bjorkvald's bed," answered his mother, "if they don't change their minds and move down again once the weather grows cold." Upstairs, too, there was a small masoned fireplace, but it gave out more smoke than heat, and the wind and weather were felt much more in the upper story. As the autumn drew to an end, a vague fear came creeping over Kristin. It waxed from day to day, and the strain made life heavy to bear. No one seemed to hear word or whisper of Erland. In the long black autumn nights she lay awake, heard the 2 little boys' even breathing, listened to the march of the storm about the house corners, and thought about Erland. If only he hadn't gone to that farm. She had not liked it at all when the cousins had fallen to talking of Haugen. Munin Bardson was with them at their lodging one of the last evenings before they were to set forth from Oslo. At that time Munin was sole owner of this little farm. It had come to him from his mother. He and Erland had been making merry, and both were not a little drunk, and while she sat chafing that they must needs bring up that unlucky place in their talk, things fell out so that Munin gave Erland the farm, so he should not be wholly landless in Norway's land. The thing was settled amid jest and laughter. Even those rumours that folk could not dwell there because it was haunted, they made sport of. The terror that had taken hold on Munin Bardson when his mother and her husband came to their miserable end up there seemed by this time in some measure to have worn off the night. And, sure enough, he made over Haugen to Erland by lawful deed. Kristin could not hide how hateful it was to her that her husband should own that uncanny place. But Erland had turned it off with a jest. "'Tis like that neither you or I will ever set foot in the place up there again, if they're still standing and they're not quite in ruin. And I think Master Arshild and Sir Bjorn won't bring us home the rents themselves. So it shouldn't matter to us if it is true, as folk say, that they walk up there." As the year waned and Kristin's thought ran ever on how it might fare with Erland north on Haugen, she grew so tongue-tied that she scarce spoke a word to her children or to the serving folk, unless she must answer their questions. And they grew so loath to speak to the mistress, save when they needs must, for she made then short and impatient answers when they broke in upon and troubled her uneasy, overwrought brooding. She herself was so unaware of this that, when at last she noticed that the two youngest children had stopped asking after their father, or speaking of him to her, she sighed and thought, children forget things quickly. For she didn't know how often she had frightened them away with impatient answers and bidden them be still and not plague her. With the older sons she scarcely spoke at all. As long as the dry frost lasted, she still could answer stranger folk who came to the manor and asked for the master, that he lay out in the fells trying his luck in hunting. Then there came a heavy snowfall, both in the parish and in the hills, the first week in Advent. Early in the morning of St. Lucia's Eve, while 'twas yet pitch dark outside and the stars showed clear, Kristin came from the byre. Then she saw, by the light of a pine torch stuck into a heap of snow, that 3 of her sons stood outside the house with skis in their hand, binding them on their feet. And a little way off stood Gout's gelding with wicker snowshoes on its feet and a pack saddle on its back. She guessed where they were going, and she dared not ask more than, when she saw one of the lads was Bjorgulf, the 2 others were Nakvi and Gout. "Are you going out on ski today, Bjorgulf? It will be bright weather, son." "I am going, mother, as you see." "Maybe you will be home before midday then?" she asked, somewhat at a loss. Bjorgulf had no skill at ski running. The glare from the snow soon hurt his eyes, and he kept him mostly within doors at winter time. But Nakvi answered that they might be gone some days. Kristin was left at home, uneasy and fearful. The twins were surly and sour. She saw that they had wanted to go too, but their grown-up brothers would not let them. Early on the 5th day, at breakfast time, the 3 came back. They had set out at cockcrow for Bjorgulf's sake, said Nakvi, that they might be home ere the sun got up. Those 2 went straightway up to the upper hall. Bjorgulf seemed like to drop with weariness, but Gout bore the sacks and the pack-saddle into the room. He had with him 2 goodly little whelps for Labrans and Munin. At the sight, the little boys forgot all questions and cares. Gout seemed to be troubled, but strove to hide it. "And this," he said, drawing it out of a sack, "this father bade me give to you. It was 14 ermine skins, very fair." His mother took them, with somewhat of an ill grace. She could not find a word to say in answer. There was all too much that she would rather have asked, but she was afraid she might lose the mastery of herself if she gave her heart the smallest vent, and Gout was so young. She could say nothing but, "They are white already, I see." "Ah, yes, we are far on in the winter half-year now." When Nakvi came down and he and Gout set them down to the porridge dish, Kristin said hastily to Frida that she herself would bear his food up to Bjorgulf in the loft. It had come to her all at once that with the silent boy, who she guessed was far riper in mind than his brothers, she could perhaps talk of this matter. He had lain down on the bed and held a linen cloth over his eyes. His mother hung a kettle of water on the pothook in the fireplace, and while Bjorgulf lay propped on his elbow and ate, she brewed a wash of dried eyebright and celandine. Kristin took from him the empty porridge bowl, bathed his red and swollen eyes with the wash, and laid damp linen cloths upon them. And then, at length, she took courage to ask, "Did he say anything, your father, of when he thought to come home to us?" "No." "You are always reluctant to talk, Björgulf," said his mother in a little while. "It seems to run in the breed, mother." He said a little after, "We met Simon and his men nearby, north of the gorge, with loaded sleighs driving northwards." "Did you speak with them?" asked the woman. "No." He laughed. "It seems to run like a sickness through our kindred. Friendship does not thrive among us." "Are you blaming me for that?" his mother flashed out. "One moment you complain that we hold our peace too much, and then you say we cannot keep our friendships." Björgulf only laughed again. Then he raised up on one elbow, as though he were listening to his mother's breathing. "In God's name, mother, do not fall a-weeping now. I am downhearted and weary. I am so unused to going on ski. And take account of what I said. I know full well that you are not a contentious woman." Kristin went forth from the loft soon after. For now she dared not, for anything in the world, ask this son what the young ones thought of these matters. So she lay night after night when the lads had gone up to the loft, waking and listening. Did they talk together when they were alone up there, she wondered? There was a thumping of boots thrown on the floor, a clatter of knife belts falling down. She heard their voices but could make out no words. Their tongues all went at once. Their voices rose. It seemed to be half quarrel, half jesting. One of the twins cried out aloud. Then someone was dragged over the floor so that dust showered down from the planks above her into the room. The balcony door flew open with a crash. Something fell heavily on the balcony floor. And then Ivar and Skjul's voices, threatening and clamouring out there while they beat on the door. Then she caught Gaut's voice, high and laughing. He stood within the door, she could hear. It was clear he and the twins had fallen out again, and the end had been that Gaut had thrown them out. Lastly she heard Nakvi's grown man's voice. He was making peace. The two came in. Yet a while the noise of talk and laughter came down to her, then the sounds of their getting into bed. Silence fell at last. In a little she heard an even drone, with stillness ever and anon. A drone like far-off thunder away in the hills. The mother smiled in the dark. Gaut snored when he was wearied out. So too had her father done. It was strange, this matter of likeness. The sons who took after Erland in an outward look were like him too in that they slept as noiselessly as birds. And while she lay thinking on all the little marks of kinship one can find so strangely, lifetime after lifetime, in the offspring of a stock, she could not forbear to smile to herself as she lay there. The torturing strain in the mother's mind slackened for a time, and drowsiness came and tangled all the threads of her thought, while she sank away first into blissful ease, and then into forgetfulness. They were young, she comforted herself. It was like they didn't take it so hardly. But one day, when the new year was begun, Cyrus Solomon, the chaplain, came to Kristin at Jorengard. It was the first time he had come thither unbidden, and Kristin gave him fair welcome, though her mind foreboded evil straight away. As she had thought, so it proved. He thought it was his duty to find out if she and her husband had wilfully and in ungodly wise severed their fellowship, and if so it were, which of the pair bore the blame for this breach of God's law. Kristin felt herself that she grew shifty-eyed and over-glib of tongue, and that she used too many words, as she set forth to the priest how Erland thought he must look after his estate north in Dovre. It had lain quite uncared for these many years. The houses, for sure, were well nigh fallen to ruin. With the many children they had, it was needful they see to their welfare, and much more to the like purpose. She glossed the matter in so many words that even Cyrus Solmond, no sharp-sighted man, must needs mark that she felt herself unsure. And now she talked and talked of how eager a hunter Erland was, as the priest well knew. She brought out and showed him the ermine skins he had given her. In her confusion, she gave them to the priest almost before she knew of it. She fretted when Cyrus Solmond was gone. Erland might have known that, when he stayed away from home in this way, a priest such as they had now would surely take it into his head to come and pry out whether anything were amiss. Cyrus Solmond was a paltry little man to look on. It wasn't easy to guess his age, but folk thought he was near about 40 winters by now. He was not over bright-witted, and of a certainty he had no learning to spare, but he was an honest, pious, well-living priest. An oldish sister of his, a childless widow and a parlous tale-bearer, cared for his small household. He would fain have shown himself a zealous servant of the church, but it was mostly on small matters and small folk that he fastened. He was fearful of spirit and shy of grappling with the big landowners or taking up ticklish questions. But if once he had done so, he was apt to grow passing stubborn and hot-headed. For all this he was well enough liked by his parishioners. For one thing, folk held him in esteem for his quiet, seemly way of life. For another, he was not near so greedy of money, or so stiff in matters that touched the church rights or folks' duties, as had been Sire Eirik. Like enough this came in the main from his lacking altogether the old priest's boldness. But Sire Eirik was loved and honoured by every man and every child in the parishes round about. Folk had often taken it amiss in the old days, when the priest had striven, with unseemly greed, to enrich and make secure the children he had had unlawfully by his serving wench. And when he first came to dwell in the parish, the people of Sill could ill brook his masterful sternness towards all who transgressed the least of the church's laws. A warrior had he been before he took the priestly vows, and he had followed the sea-rover Earl Sir Alf of Tornberg in his youth. It was easy to see this in his ways. But even then the parish folk had been proud of their priest, for he was far above most priests of the country parishes in learning, wisdom, strength of body, and chieftainly bearing, and he had the noblest singing voice. And with the years, and under the heavy trials that God seemed to have laid upon his servant by reason of his youthful untowardliness, Sire Eirik Carrison had so grown in wisdom, piety, and righteousness that his name was now known and honoured over the whole bishopric. When he journeyed to the synod at Hamar town, he was honoured as a father by all the other priests, and it was said that Bishop Halvard would gladly have preferred him to a church which carried with it a noble rank and a seat in the cathedral chapter. But it was said that Sire Eirik had begged that he might be left where he was. He had pleaded his age, and that his sight had been dim these many years past. In Sill there stood by the highway, a little south of Formoe, the fair cross of potstone which Sire Eirik had set up at his own cost, where a stone slip from the mountainside had taken from him both his young hopeful sons 40 years before. Even now the older folk of the parish couldn't pass it without stopping to say paternosters and aves for Alf's and Car's souls. His daughter the priest had wedded from his manor with a fair dowry of goods and cattle. He gave her to a comely and well-born farmer's son from Viken. None thought other than that John Fiss was a good young fellow. 6 years after, she came home to her father, starved, broken, ragged and lousy, with a child by each hand and one beneath her belt. The folk who had lived in Sill in those days knew well, though they had never spoken of it, The children's father had been hanged for a thief in Oslo. The Johnsons turned out but ill, and now they were dead, all three. Even while his issue were yet alive, it had been Sira Eirik's zealous care to deck and do honour to his church with gifts. Now it would be it, perhaps, that would get the greater part of his wealth and his costly books. The new church of St. Olaf and St. Thomas in Sill was much greater and statelier than the old one that had burned down, and Sira Eirik had bestowed on it many noble and costly adornments. He went each day to church for prayer and meditation, but for the folks he now said Mass on the high holy days only. It was Sira Solomon who now carried on most of the duties of the priestly office. But when folk had a heavy grief to bear, or were vexed at soul by great troubles or the stings of conscience, they rather sought the old parish priest, and all thought that from a communing with Sira Eirik they had ever brought comfort home with them. And so one evening on towards spring, Kristin Lavransdatter went to Romangard and knocked upon the door of Sira Eirik's house. But she knew not herself rightly how she should set forth what she had to say. So when she had made her offering, she sat talking of this and that. At length the old man said, something impatiently, "Have you come in but to greet me, Kristin, and see how I fare? 'Tis kindly done of you, if so, but I think you have something else on your heart. And if so be it, speak of it now, and don't waste my time with empty talk." Kristin laid her hands together in her lap and looked down. "I don't like it, Sira Eirik, that my husband is living up yonder at Haugen." "I don't think the way there is so long," said the priest. "But you can get up there easily enough to speak with him and beg him to return home soon. There can't be very much for him to look at upon that little one-man croft that he need stay there longer." "I am afraid when I think of him dwelling there alone these winter nights," said the wife, shuddering. "Erland Nikolausen is sure old enough and bold enough to look after himself." "Sira Eirik, you know all that befell up there once upon a time," whispered Kristin, so low she could barely be heard. The priest turned his dim old eyes towards her. Once they had been coal-black, bright and keen. He said nothing. "You have heard, perhaps, what folks say," she said as low as before, "that the dead walk there?" "Do you mean you dare not seek him out for that? Or are you afraid that the ghosts will break your husband's neck? If they haven't done it yet, Kristin, 'tis like they will let him be hereafter also." The priest laughed harshly. "Ah, 'tis folly. Nothing but heathenish superstitious prattle, the most of the tales folks spread about of ghosts and of dead men that walk. There are stern doorkeepers, I think, where Sir Bjorn and Lady Arshild are." "Sira Eirik," she whispered, trembling, "do you think then there is no salvation for those two poor souls?" "God forbid that I should be so overbold to judge of the bounds of his mercy. But I can scarce think that those two have been able to quit their score so soon. Not yet have all the tablets been showed forth on which they two carved out their witness. Her children that she forsook, you two that were prentices in the wise lady's school. If I thought it could help, so that somewhat of the ill she did might be righted, then... But since Erland tarries there, 'tis like God doesn't think it would avail him anything if his mother's sister should show herself and warn him. For this we know, by God's mercy and Our Lady's pity and the prayers of the Church, it may befall that a poor soul have leave to come back to this earthly home out of the fires of purgatory, if his sin be such that it can be made good by the help of living men, and his time of torture shortened thereby. As it was with the unhappy soul who shifted the boundary between Herve and Japstad, and the farmer in Mustal with the false letters concerning the mill race. But no soul can come out from purgatory fire unless it have such a lawful errand. All else is trumpery, the most of what folk prate of, ghosts and evil spirits. Or it is the devil's jugglery that melt away like smoke when you ward with the sign of the cross and the Lord's name. "But the blessed who are with God, Sire Eirik?" she asked again, low. "The holy ones with him, you know well he can send on his errands with good gifts and messages from paradise." "I told you once that I had seen Brother Edvin Ricardson," she said as before. "Yes, either it was a dream, and it might have been sent by God or your guardian angel, or else the monk is a holy saint." Kristin whispered, trembling. "Sire, my father, Sire Eirik, I have prayed so much that it might be granted me to see his face but once. I long to see him so unspeakably, Sire Eirik, and maybe I might understand what he would that I should do. Could I but once have counsel of my father?" She had to bite her lips and brush away with the fall of her coif the tears that were coming. The priest shook his head. "Pray for his soul, Kristin. Though I well believe that Lavrans and your mother with him are now long since comforted, in the house of them whose comfort they sought in all their sorrows while they lived here on earth. And true and sure it is that Lavrans holds you fast in his love in that place too. But your prayers and masses for his soul peace bind you and us all to him. Aye, the way of it, 'tis one of the secret things which are hard to understand. But do not doubt that this way is better than that he should be disquieted in his peace, that he might come hither and show himself to you." Kristin was forced to sit a while before she grew so far mistress of herself that she dared speak. But then she told the priest all that had fallen between her and Erland that night in the hearthroom house, saying over every word that was spoken as near as she remembered it. The priest sat long silent when she had done speaking. Then she smote her hands together vehemently. "Sire Eirik, do you think that so much of the wrong was with me, that it is no sin of Erland to have fled from me and all our sons in this way? Do you think it is just for him to crave that I should seek him out, kneel before him and eat my words that I spoke amiss? I know that without this he will not come home to us." "Do you think you need to call Lavrans back from his other home to ask his counsel in this matter?" The priest rose and laid his hand upon the woman's shoulder. "The first time I saw you, Kristin, you were a tender little maid. Lavrans took you between his knees, laid your little hands crosswise on your breast, and bade you say Paternoster to me. Clearly and sweetly you could say it, though you didn't understand one word. Afterward you learned the meaning of every prayer in our tongue. Perhaps you have forgotten it now. Have you forgotten that your father taught you and did honour to you and loved you? He did honour to this man you are now afraid to humble yourself before. Or have you forgotten how fair he made the feast in honour of you two? And how you rode from his manor like two thieves, stealing away with you Lavrans Bjorgulfsson's worship and honour?" Sobbing, Kristin hid her face in her hands. "Do you remember yet, Kristin, how he craved of you two that you fall down on your knees before him, before he thought he could raise you up again into his fatherly love? Do you think it's all too hard a morsel for your pride if you must bear yourself now before a man whom you have wronged, maybe, less than you sinned against your father?" "Jesus!" Kristin wept most piteously. "Jesus, have mercy!" "I hear you remember his name," said the priest, "the name of him your father strove to follow as a disciple and to serve as a faithful knight." He touched the little crucifix which hung above them. God's Son died sinless upon the cross to atone for our transgressions against him. Go home now, Kristin, and think about this that I have said to you, said Sigrid Undset when she had stopped weeping. But in these same days southerly storms set in, gales, sleet and rain in torrents. At times it so raged that folk found it hard to cross over their own courtyards without risk of being blown clean over the housetops, as one might almost think. No one could travel by the parish roads. The spring floods came down so sudden and furious that folk fled from the farms most in danger. Kristin shifted most of her goods up into the new storehouse loft, and she got leave to put the cattle in Sigrid Undset's spring byre. The Jorengard spring byre lay on the farther side of the river. It was cruelly toilsome work in the rough weather. All through the paddocks the snow lay soft as melting butter, and the beasts were poor and weak. It had been a hard winter. 2 of the best young steers broke a leg as they walked. They snapped like brittle stalks. The day they shifted the cattle, Simon Dar, with 4 of his housecarls, appeared of a sudden, halfway. They set themselves to help. Amidst the wind and rain and all the press and bustle, with cows that had to be held up and sheep and lambs that must be carried, there was no making oneself heard, nor leisure for the kinsfolk to talk. But when they were come into Jorengard in the evening, and Kristin had got Simon and his men seated in the hall, all who had been at work that day stood much in need of a draught of warm ale, Simon was able to have some speech with her. He begged her to come to Formo with the women and children, and he and 2 of his men would stay here with Ulf and the lads. Kristin thanked him, but said she would stay on her manor. Lavrans and Munin were at Ulfvoldstein already, and Jartrud had sought refuge at Sira Solmund's. She had come to be such good friends with the priest's sister. Simon said, "Folks think it strange, Kristin, that you 2 sisters never meet together. Ramborg will be upset if I come home without you." "I know well it looks strange," said the woman, "but it would seem yet stranger, I think, were I to go a-visiting my sister now when the master of this house is away from home, and folk know that you and he are unfriends." On this Simon said no more, and soon after he and his men took their leave. The week preceding Ascension Day came in with a fearful storm, and by Tuesday news went around among the farms in the north of the parish that now had the flood swept away the bridge up in the gorge, which folk must cross when they were bound for the Hervring Satyrs. They began to fear now for the great bridge south by the church. It was built most strongly of the stoutest timbers and arched high in the middle, propped below with great tree trunks set deep in the river bed. But now the water swept over the bridge ends where they joined the banks, and the bridge arch was packed and choked with all manner of driftage, whirled down the stream from the north. The Lagan had flooded the low fields on both banks now, and at one place on the Jorengard lands, where there was a hollow in the meadows, the water ran inwards like a bay, almost up to the houses, and the roof of the smithy and the tops of the trees showed above it like small islands. The outbarn on the holm had been washed away already. From the farms on the east side of the river, few men had come to church. They were fearful that the bridge might go in church time and cut them off from their homes. But up on the other bank, on the hillside under the Laugarbru barn, where there was a little shelter from the storm, might be espied between the snow flurries a black clump of people. The word went round that Sigrid Undset had said he would bear the cross over the bridge and set it on the eastern bank, even if no one dared follow him. A snow squall swept straight in the men's faces as the procession stepped out from the church. The snow drove through the air in slanting streaks. Of the countryside but glimpses could be seen. Now and again a cantlet of the blackening lake where the meadows had been, cloud scudding sweeping across the screes and the tongues of forest on the hillsides, glimpses high up of fell-tops against the high-piled clouds. The air was loaded with a mingled roar. The river's drone rising and falling, the rushing noise of the woods, the howling of the wind, and ever and again there was a dull booming echo of the raging of the storm among the mountains, and the thunder of slides of new snow. The tapers were blown out as soon as they were borne from out of the church cloisterway. This day grown young men had donned the choir boys' white surplices. The wind tore at them. They walked, a whole cluster of them, holding the banner, with hands grasping the cloth, that the wind might tear it in shreds, while the procession, with bodies bent forward, went its way against the wind across the hillside. But over the raging of the storm rose now and then a few notes of Sira Irik's ringing voice as he fought his way forward, singing, "Come, and let us return unto the Lord, for he hath torn, and he will heal us. He hath smitten, and he will bind us up, and we shall live in his sight. Then we shall know if we follow on to know the Lord." Hallelujah! Kristin stopped, she and all the other women, when the procession came to the place where the water had overflowed the road. But the white-clad young men, the deacons and the priests, were up on the bridge already, and well nigh all the men followed after. The water reached to their knees. The bridge trembled and shook, and now the women were aware that from upstream a whole house was coming down, driving upon the bridge. Round and round it was spun by the stream as it bore downwards. It was rent half in twain, and the logs were spread asunder, but yet it hung together. The wife from Ulvaldsdene clung close to Kristin Lavransdatter and wailed aloud. Her husband's 2 half-grown brothers were amongst the choir lads. Kristin cried silently upon the Virgin Mary and strained her eyes towards the crowd on the middle of the bridge, where she could make out Narkvi's white-clad form among the men holding the flag. Through all the noise, the women thought they could still hear tones of Sira Irik's chant. He halted on the crown of the bridge and lifted the cross high as the house struck. The bridge tottered and groaned. To the folk on both banks it seemed as though it settled somewhat towards the south. Then the procession went on, was lost from sight behind the bridge's arching back, and came into sight upon the other shore. The wrecked house had tangled itself in the mass of other driftage clinging to the lower timbers of the roadway. Then, sudden as a heavenly sign, silvery light dropped through the wind-driven cloud masses. A faint gleam, as of molten lead, was spread over the swollen river far and wide. Mists and clouds burst asunder, the sun broke through, and when the procession came back across the bridge, its beams sparkled on the cross. On the priest's wet white alb, the crossed stripes of the stole shone a wondrous purple blue. Gold and glittering wet the dale lay, as in the bottom of a cave of blue darkness, for, smitten down by the sun's rays, the storm clouds clung high up round the brows of the fells and made the uplands black. Between the heights the mists were fleeing, and the great mountain dome above Formoe rose up from the blackness, blinding white with new fallen snow. She had seen Narkvi go by. The dripping wet vestments clung about the boys, while they sang with might and main out into the sunshine. "Saviour of the world, save us all! Christ have mercy! Christ have mercy! Christ hear us!" The priests, the cross, had gone by. The crowd of farmers followed, heavy in their soaking clothes, but they looked about them with wondering, shining faces at the parting storm as they joined in the pealing supplication. Then she saw. She did not believe her eyes. It was she now who must cling to her neighbour woman for support. Surely it was Erland who walked there in the procession. He was clad in a dripping wet reindeer skin coat with the hood over his head. But it was he. With half-open mouth he cried Kyrie eleison like the rest. Now he looked straight at her as he went by. She could not read the look on his face aright. There was something like the shadow of a smile upon it. Together with the other women, she followed the procession up over the church green, chanting loud with the others in unison with the young lads who sang the litany. She was aware of nothing but the wild hammering of her own heart. During the Mass, she had a glimpse of him only one time. She dared not stand in her usual place. She hid herself in the gloom in the northern aisle. As soon as the service was at an end, she hastened out. She fled from her serving women who had been in the church. Outside, the whole valley was steaming in the sun. Kristin ran home, heedless of the bottomless mire of the way. She spread her board and set the brimming mead horn before the master's high seat, before she gave herself time to change her wet clothes for her holy day wear. The dark blue broidered dress, the silver belt, the buckled shoes and the coif with the blue borders. Then she fell on her knees in the closet. She could not think. She could not find words of her own. So she said over and over again, Ave Maria, Blessed Lady mine, dear Lord, Son of the Virgin, Thou knowest what I would say. Time dragged slowly by. From her maids she heard that the men had gone to the bridge again. They were plying axes and hooks to loosen the mass of wreckage that had stuck fast, striving to save the bridge. The priests had gone there too, when they had laid aside their vestments. It was long past midday when the men came in. Her sons, Ulf Alderson, and the 3 housecarls, an old man and 2 small parish boys who were kept on the manor. Narkvi had already sat down in his place, to the right of the master's high seat. Suddenly he rose, left his place and made for the door. Kristin called him by name, half aloud. On that he came back and sat down again. The colour came and went in the young face. He kept his eyes cast down, and ever and anon would set his teeth in his underlip. His mother saw he was hard put to keep mastery over himself, yet he won through the trial. And at last the meal was at an end. The sons on the inner bench rose, came round the end of the board where was the empty high seat, settled their belts a little after they had stuck their knives back into the sheaths, and went out. When they were all gone, Kristin followed. The sun shone warm and runnels were pouring from every roof. There was not a soul in the courtyard save Ulf. He stood on the stone slab outside his own house door. A strangely helpless look came into his face as the mistress came towards him. He said nothing. She asked low, "Did you speak with him?" "Not many words. I did see Narkvi and he talking together." A little after he spoke again. He was somewhat afraid for all of you when there came down such a flood, so the thought took him to come home and see how things were going. Narkvi told him how you had managed. I don't know where he had heard it, that you had given away the skins he sent you by gout in the autumn. He was angry at that, and he was angry too when he found you had slipped straight home after Mass. He thought you would have stayed and spoken with him. Kristin said nothing. She turned and went inside. This summer there were endless broils and bickerings between Ulf Haldarsson and his wife. Ulf's half-brother's son, Haldor Johnson, had come to his kinsman in the spring and brought his wife with him. He had wedded the year before. Now it was meant that Haldor should take on lease the farm Ulf owned in Skaun and flit thither on term day. But Jartrud was angry, for she thought Ulf had given his brother's son over good terms, and she saw that the men had in mind that, in one way or another, things should be so ordered that the heritage of the farm be assured to Haldor. Haldor had been Kristin's page boy at Huseby, and she had much liking for the young man. His wife, too, a quiet, winsome young woman, she liked well. A little after midsummer, the two young folk had a son born to them, and Kristin lent her the weaving house, where the mistresses of the manor had themselves been wont to lie when they bore children. But Gardrud took it ill that Kristin waited on the lying-in woman as the chief of the midwives, though Gardrud herself was young and most unskilled, and could neither help a woman in childbirth nor care for a newborn babe. Kristin was godmother to the boy, and Ulf gave the christening feast. But Gardrud thought that he spent too much money on it, and that the gifts he laid in the cradle and on the mother's bed were by far too great. To stop her mouth a little, Ulf gave his wife, before all men's faces, many costly things from among his chattels, a gilt cross and chain, a fur-lined cloak with a great silver clasp, a finger ring of gold, and a brooch. But she saw that he would not give her one single rood of the land he owned, beyond what was her extra gift when he wedded her. All his land was to go to his half-brothers and sisters, if he himself had no children. And now Gardrud bemoaned herself that her child had been stillborn, and that it looked not as though she should have more children. She was soon a laughing-stock among all the neighbours, for talking of this to everyone. By reason of these bickerings, Ulf had to pray Kristin to let Halldor and Aldhild dwell in the hearth-room house when the young wife had held her churching. Kristin agreed gladly. She held aloof from Halldor, for it brought back to her so much that was sore to think on when she talked with him that had attended her in those old days. But much talk fell between her and the wife, for Aldhild was bent on helping Kristin in every way she could. And in the end of summer the child fell sorely sick, and on that Kristin took it in hand and tended it for the young unlessoned mother. When in autumn the two young folk set forth northwards, she missed them, but most of all the little baby boy. Foolish as she herself knew it was, yet she had not been able these last years to rid her of a sort of sorrow, because all at once she seemed to have grown barren, though she was no old woman, not yet 40 years. It had helped her to keep her mind from grievous thoughts that she had the young childish wife and the little babe to help and tend. And heavy as she thought it to see that Ulf Halldorson had not had better fortune in his marriage, yet had the happenings in the steward's house helped to take her thoughts away from other things. For after the way in which Erland had behaved on Ascension Day, she dared scarce think how it all would end. That he had come down to the parish and to the church before all folks' eyes, and then had made off north again without greeting his wife with so much as one word, seemed to her so cruel that she thought now at last she no longer cared what he might do. With Simon Anderson she had not changed a word since that day of the spring flood when he came to help her. At the church she greeted him, and most often spoke a few words with her sister. What they thought of her affairs and of Erland's betaking him up to Dover, she knew not. But the Sunday before St. Bartholomew's Mass, Sir Gerd of Differen came with the Formoe folks to church. Simon looked wondrous glad as he went into Mass by his brother's side, and after the service Ramborg came over to Kristin and whispered eagerly that she was with child again and looked to be brought to bed at Maria Mass in the spring. "Kristin, sister, can you not come home and drink with us this day?" Kristin shook her head sorrowfully, patted the young wife's pale cheek, and prayed that God might turn this to joy and blessing for the parents. But go to Formoe she could not, she said. After the breach with his brother-in-law, Simon had forced himself to believe that it was better so. He was so placed that he didn't need to ask what folk judged of his doings in all things. He had helped Erland and Kristin in their greatest need, and as for the help he could be to them here in the parish, it was not so much worth it that he should make such a tangled web of his own life. But when he heard that Erland was gone from the parish, it was no longer possible for Simon to uphold the heavy, stubborn calm he had striven to feel. In vain he told himself that no one, sure, rightly knew what was at the bottom of Erland's long staying away from home. Folks talked so much and knew so little. But however it might be, he could not mix himself in the matter. Yet his mind was never at rest. At times he wondered whether he should seek out Erland at Haugen and eat the words he had said when they parted. Thereafter he might see whether he could not find some way to set things right between his brother-in-law and his wife's sister. But he came no further than to think on it. He didn't believe, indeed, anyone could notice that he was so uneasy in mind. He lived as he was used to do, worked on his farm and cared for his estates, was merry and drank manfully with his boon companions, lay out in the fells a-hunting when he had time, spoiled his children when he was at home, and never did an unkind word fall between him and his wife. To the folk on the manor, it must rather seem as if the love between him and Ramborg were greater than ever before, since his wife was much more quiet and even in her bearing, and no longer fell into those fits of whimsy and childish anger over trifling matters. But in secret Simon felt himself shy and unsure in his dealings with her. No longer could he bring himself to take her as though she too was still half a child, to be teased and spoiled. He didn't know how he should behave towards her. And so he didn't know either how he should take it, when one evening she said to him that now she was with child again. "You are not so happy about it, I think," he said at length, stroking her hand. "But you are glad, I hope?" Ramborg nestled close to him, half laughing, half crying, and he laughed somewhat shamefacedly as he took her in his arms. "This time I will be good and quiet, Simon, and not moan and wail as before. But you must stay with me, do you hear? If all your brothers were in prison and being led to the gallows, you must not forsake me." Simon laughed sadly. "Where would I go, my Ramborg? 'Tis not like that Geirmund, poor cripple, will broil himself in any great matter. And you know well he is the only man now of my blood or kin that I am not at odds with." "Oh," Ramborg laughed too, through her tears. "Those quarrels will last no longer than till they need a helping hand, and you think you can give it. I know you well now, my husband." It was 14 days later that all unlooked for Gerd Andresen came to the manor. The different knight had but one henchman attending him. Few words passed between the brothers at their meeting. Sir Gerd said somewhat of how he had not seen his sister and brother-in-law at Crook these many years, and how the thought had come to him that he might journey up hither and give them greeting. And once he was in the Dale, Sigrid thought surely he ought to visit at Formo too. "And I thought, brother, it was not like you were so angry with me, but that you would give me and my man food and shelter till tomorrow." "You may believe that," said Simon. He stood looking down, flushed dark red in the face. "It was kindly done of you, Gert, to come to me." The brothers strolled out together after they had eaten. The corn was beginning to yellow here on the sunny slopes down towards the river. It was mostly good weather. The Lagan shone gently enough now, in little white gleams down among the alder woods. Great white clouds sailed over the summer sky. Sunshine filled the great bowl of the dale, and the fell right over against them lay all soft blue and green in the haze of the heat and the drifting shadows of the clouds. From within the paddock behind them came the thudding of horses' hoofs on the dry ground. The herd came trotting through the alder bush. Simon leaned over the fence. "Colty, Colty! Your horse Bronzefine. He begins to grow old now," he said, as Gerd's horse put his head over the paling and nosed at his master's shoulder. 18 winters. Gerd fondled the horse. "I thought, kinsman, this matter. "It were all too ill a thing if it should part the friendship between you and me," he said, and didn't look at his brother. "It has grieved me every day," answered Simon low, "and I thank you for your coming, Gerd." They went farther along the fence, Gerd first, Simon tramping after. At last they sat down on the edge of a little stony stretch of burned-up yellow sward. There was a sweet, strong scent from the small haycocks that lay here and there amid the stone heaps, where the sickles had scraped together a little short, flowery hay. Gerd told of the parley between King Magnus and the Haftorsons and their following. After a while, Simon asked, "Do you think that any of those kinsmen of Erland Nikolausen should try to win him a full pardon and bring him back to the king's favour?" "I cannot do much," said Gerd Dar. "And they have no love for him, Simon, they that might perchance have the power." "I have little mind to speak of that now. I thought he seemed a bold, winning fellow, but he showed up ill in that enterprise of his. That's what the others think. But I would rather not talk of this now. I know well this brother-in-law of yours is so dear to you." Simon sat gazing out at the silvery gleams in the tree-tops on the slope below, and at the glittering sheen of the river. Wonderingly he thought, in a way it was true what Gerd had said. "However that be, these days we are not friends, Erland and I," said he. "'Tis a long while since we spoke together." "Maybe you have grown passing quarrelsome with the years, Simon," said Gerd, laughing a little. "But have you never thought," he asked a little after, "to leave these dales? We kinsmen might be of more help one to the other if we dwelt more near together." "Can you think of such a thing? Formo is my Udal heritage. Asmund of Eichen owns his part of that manor by right of Udal, and I know he's not unwilling to change Udal against Udal. 'Tis still in his thoughts that he might get your Arnjerd for Grund according to the terms he proffered." Simon shook his head. "Our father's mother's kin have had their seat on Formo Manor ever since this land was heathen, and 'tis here I have ever meant that Andres shall dwell after me. I think you have lost your wits, brother. Why should I part me from Formo?" "No, you're right, what you say." Gerd grew somewhat red. "I thought that, but perhaps, maybe, in Raumarik you have most of your kinsfolk and the friends of your youth, that perchance you might think that there you would thrive more happily." "I thrive here." Simon too had grown red. "Here is the place where I can set the boy in a safe seat." He looked at Gerd, and his brother's fine-cut lined face took on something of a bashful look. Gerd's hair was well nigh white now, but he was as slender and lithe of body as ever. He moved a little uneasily. Some stones slipped from the heap he leaned on and rolled down the slope into the corn. "Are you going to rake the whole scree down on my fields?" asked Simon, laughing, with a feigned gruffness. Gerd sprang up, light and nimble, and held out a hand to his brother, who had a heavier weight to move. Simon kept his brother's hand in his for a moment after he had got to his feet. Then he laid his own hand upon his brother's shoulder. On that Gerd did the like. With their hands lying lightly on each other's shoulders, the brothers went slowly up over the hillside towards the manor. They sat together over in the Seaman's Hall in the evening. Simon was to sleep with his brother. They had said their evening prayers, but they felt they must empty the ale bowl before they went to rest. "Benedictus tu in mulibris, mulibris." "Do you remember that?" laughed Simon all at once. "Yes, it cost me a thrashing many a time, until Sira Magnus got my grandmother's false doctrine out of my head." Gerd smiled at the memory. Hard-handed as the devil he was, too. Do you remember, brother, once as we sat scratching his legs and had lifted the skirt off his habit? You whispered to me that, had you been so crook-legged as Magnus Ketelsen, you too would have been a priest and gone always in a long gown. Simon smiled. It seemed to him he saw all at once his brother's boyish face, bursting with choked laughter for all its piteous, rueful eyes. They were yet young boys then, and Sire Magnus was very hard of hand when he set to correcting them. Overbright Gerd had not been when they were children. Ay, and it was not because he was an over and above wise man that he loved Gerd now. But he grew warm with thankfulness and tenderness towards his brother as he sat there, for every day of their brotherhood well nigh 40 years now. For Gerd was the most guileless, the most true-hearted of men. And so this, that he had won back his brother Gerd, seemed to Simon much as though he had at the least got a fast foothold with one foot. And for long now his life had been so woefully warped and tangled. He felt a warm glow each time he thought of Gerd, who had come to him to make good again the breach he himself had made, when he rode from his brother's manor in anger and with unseemly words. His heart overflowed with thankfulness. He had others to thank besides Gerd. A man like Lavrans now. How he would have taken such a happening he knew well enough. He could follow his father-in-law as far as he was worthy to follow, with almsgiving and the like. Such things as a broken and contrite heart, an adoration of the Lord's wounds, were beyond him, unless he stared his eyes out at the crucifix, and that was not what Lavrans had meant. Tears of repentance he could not weep. He didn't think that he had wept more than maybe 2 or 3 times since he had left childhood, and not then when he had the most need to have done so, those times when he had fallen into great transgression, with Arnjerd's mother while he was a wedded man, and then that manslaying a year back. And yet he had repented sorely. It seemed to him he repented his sins heartily at all times, confessed them fully and made amends according to the priest's behest. He said his prayers always with diligence, took heed to give the right tithes and abundant alms, most of all to the honour of St. Simon the Apostle, St. Olaf, St. Michael and Mary Virgin. Otherwise he rested content with what Sire Eirik said, that in the cross alone was salvation, and how else a man should meet and fight the enemy was in God's hands, not his. But now he felt himself drawn to show, with somewhat more fervency, his deep thankfulness to all the holy ones. He had been born on the birthday of Mary Virgin, so his mother had said. It came to his mind that he would like to pay the Lord's Mother his homage by a prayer he was not wont to say daily. He had written down a goodly prayer the time he was at the king's court, and now he sought out the little scroll. He was afraid, indeed, now he thought of it, it was more to please King Haakon than for the sake of God and Mary, that he had got him, while he was with the bodyguard, some such little rolls with prayers, and learnt them. All the young men did it, for it was the king's wont to question his pages on what they knew of such profitable lore, when he lay abed of nights and could not sleep. Ah, yes, that was a long time ago now. The king's bedchamber in the stone hall of the royal castle at Oslo. On the little board by the bed stood a single taper burning. Its gleam fell upon the fine-cut, wan and aged face that lay propped among the red silk pillows. When the priest had ended his reading aloud and was gone, the king himself often took the book and lay reading with the heavy tome leaned against his drawn-up knees. On 2 footstools away by the great stone-walled chimney sat the pages. He himself kept watch, nigh always along with Gunstein Ingerson. It was pleasant in the chamber. The fire burned clear and hot, and gave out no smoke. The room seemed so warm and snug with its cross-vaulted ceiling, and walls always hung with tapestries. But they grew sleepy sitting that way, first hearing the priest read and afterwards waiting for the king to fall asleep. It was scarce ever much before midnight. When he slept, they had leave to take turns at watching and to rest between whiles on the bench between the chimney and the door of the council hall. So they sat, waiting for him to fall asleep and swallowing down their yawns. It might happen that the king would fall into talk with them. Not often, but when he did, he was marvellous kindly and winning. Or he would read aloud from a book a wise saying or some few staves of verse that he thought might profit the young men, or be wholesome for them to hear. One night he was wakened himself by King Haakon calling him. It was pitch dark. The taper had burned out. Miserably shamed, he quickly went to blow the embers alive again and lit a new candle. The king lay smiling slyly. "Does this Gunstein always snore so fearfully?" "Ah, yes, my lord." "You share his bed in the hostel too, I think. I think were but reason you should ask to be given another bedfellow who makes less noise in his sleeping." "I thank my good lord, but it matters nothing to me, Lord King." "But you must needs wake Simon when this thunder peal breaks loose by your ear, is it not so?" "Ay, your grace, but I have but to give him a jog and turn him over somewhat." The king laughed. I marvel if you young men understand that such a stomach to sleep is a great gift from God. When you come to my years, Simon, perhaps then you will remember my words." That was endlessly far away, and yet clear, but it seemed not as if it could be the man sitting here that had been that young page. One day when Advent was beginning, and Kristin was well nigh alone at the manor, her sons were carting home firewood and moss, she wondered to see Simon Dar come riding into the courtyard. His errand was to bid her and her sons to a feast at Formoe at Yule. "Sure you must know, Simon, that we cannot do as you would," she said soberly. "Friends we can be as much as ever, in our hearts, you and Ramborg and I. But you know well that it rests not always with us to do as we would like." "You cannot mean that you will go so far in this as not to come to your only sister's help when she is to lie in the straw?" Kristin prayed that all might go well and end in joy for them both. "But I cannot say for sure that I can come." "Everyone will think it passing strange," said Simon vehemently. "You have the name of being the best of midwives, and she is your sister. And you two are mistresses of the two greatest manors on this northern countryside. Not a few children have been born into the world on the great manors here these last years, and I have not been even asked to come. No longer is it so, Simon, that it is not reckoned that all is done fittingly in the lying room if the mistress of Jorengard is not there." She saw that he grew much disheartened at her words, and she went on. "Greet Ramborg and say I will go to her and help her when the time comes. But to your Yuletide feast I cannot come, Simon." But on the 8th day of Yule she met Simon coming to Mass without Ramborg. No, all was well with her, he said, but it was well for her to rest and gather strength. For tomorrow he was faring south to Differen with her and the children. The roads were so good for sleigh travel, and since Gerd had begged them to come, and Ramborg had such a mind to it, well, why not?